In this video, I'm going to tell you my bare bones checklist for prepping for Session 1 in your very first homebrew world. Welcome to the Fantasy Fellows. I'm Chris, your resident GM. In this episode, we're going to go through the 7 steps that I think every GM should take to prep for their Session 1 of a homebrew campaign. Make sure to stick around to the end to hear a bonus tip on how to make sure that Session 1 goes as smoothly as possible. One of the most common issues for new GMs in their first homebrew world is they just never actually get started playing. And that's because they think they need to develop histories from hundreds of years ago, complex political dynamics between factions that they won't even see for 10, 20, 30 sessions. If you're going to go down that route, that's great and that's creative, but at that point you're just writing a book. To play D&D, you need to have sessions. And to that end, that brings us right to step number 1, which is set a date for your Session 1. Now, this is something you obviously need to work out with the players, but I'd recommend something like 4 to 6 weeks out. Anything earlier than 4 weeks can be a bit stressful, especially if it's your first time building something from scratch. But 4 to 6 weeks out is plenty of time that you have time to work with the players on developing the world a little bit. You have time to put together the resources you want so you'll feel comfortable in your first session. But it's also not so far out that the players will lose interest and you'll end up with this massive unwieldy world that really doesn't add that much to the game. And that brings us to step number 2, which is reviewing the characters' backstories. A D&D campaign isn't about the characters walking through your story. It's about you providing a world in which those characters exist and play, and you allow them to shape it as they move forward. It's super important that you understand what your party, the players themselves, are interested in doing. Are they super combat focused, where they really want to find the biggest, baddest creatures or humanoids in the region and take them out? Or are they more politically inclined, where it's more of an intrigue campaign? Would they be interested in more of a mystery? Or do they end up wanting to build their own trade empire and take over the economic future of the continent? You're not going to know unless you talk to the players and look at their backstories. The backstories are a great place to find clues as to where the players are really going to want to go in this campaign. And the best thing is, it can take a lot of heavy lifting off of you. If you sit down with just a blank map and try to develop your own region, kingdom, continent, it can be a pretty daunting task at first. Instead, what I like to do is I like to leverage locations and history from the players' backstories and then fill in the details around that. I find that a good split is something like 50-50, where 50% of the details for that first map that I make are taken from players' backstories, and then I fill in the other 50% to kind of help make that world feel whole and connected and make sense. Now, you might think that 50% is quite a lot to have the players already know about. But when you think about it, if you have 4 players in your group, one person's going to know about a couple, another person's going to know about a couple different locations, maybe there's some overlap here and there, but for the most part, each individual player is going to know maybe 20% of locations. And that's pretty good in that they have 80% to explore, but the 20% that they know about and have some backstory from, it's an amazing opportunity when you enter that town, village, hideout, whatever, that player will then be able to say, I know this place. I know how to go in the back alleys to get to the castle faster and without being noticed. Or I know the NPC that we need to talk to in this location. And that really helps in later sessions have the players help drive the story. There's no better feeling as a GM than to sit back and have the players run that story for you and only have to jump in here and there to help out. Alright, that brings us to step number 3, which is to develop the initial region that the party's going to start off in. Now, as the GM, it is your responsibility to choose where in your world the party's adventure is going to begin. And I highly recommend you pick somewhere simple. Don't pick the capital city that has economic and political factions vying against each other. Pick a village that is somewhat remote. By choosing a village, you're able to spend the time that you need to on a few key NPCs and some key elements to really make sure that you have a good handle on them, and that when your players jump in, you're going to really understand that immediate world. Instead of having to worry about 20 million different NPCs and factions, you can really focus down. Now, when you're developing that village, you need to ask yourself some questions, and I like to go more towards the side of realism. personal choice, but that helps me. I like asking myself questions like, why is this village here? What is its purpose? Villages don't just pop up out of the middle of nowhere and have, 10, 15, 40 people live there just because it seems like a nice place. There's generally a purpose. Is it along a river? Is it at an oasis in a desert? Is it near a mine out into the mountains? Is it along the coast and maybe there's some trade involved? And as you start asking yourself these questions and you start asking why is it there and what biome is it in, you can really start understanding a little bit more flavor about the village, and some of the details just kind of start coming to you. Okay, it's a coastal village, so most likely there's some trade involved. Also, most likely there's a lot of food coming from the ocean. So if that's the case, all of a sudden, boom, you have an NPC that is a fisherman. Okay, a fisherman's going out most days. Maybe he finds something interesting. All right, there is likely somebody running the town that maybe is more trade-based. Do people like him? Do they not like him? Those sorts of questions just start to come naturally. So ask yourself some basic questions about the purpose of the village, the flavor starts coming out, and then you can kind of flush in the rest. All right, step number 4 is create some tension. Now, you don't want the party to jump into this village and have nothing happening. Nothing sounds more boring to me than you all show up in a village and everything is normal, the harvest is going great, and everyone is happy. Why are we playing? What's the point? Where do we go next? Those are the questions you don't want your players to be asking. You need to present a clear problem, usually within the first 10 minutes of playing, is my recommendation. Now, there's a ton of ways to do this. The most obvious is there are attacks coming from the north. And I know this is a cliche, but it works really well. There are attacks coming from the north means there's a clear and present danger that the players need to go and investigate. Maybe there's a little bit of role-playing in the town to kind of figure out and gather more information or gather some supplies or something like that. But then they are off to the races, and they're going to be heading over to that threat to try to neutralize it in whatever way they can. There's a lot of other ways to do this too, though. It doesn't have to be a combat objective. Maybe there's some sort of a mystery going on. Something has been stolen. A child has been abducted. There's a mysterious illness. Something to that effect can really be an interesting way to go a little bit more role-play heavy, where the characters need to spend more time in the village, talking to the NPCs, understanding what is going on exactly. And that can be a ton of fun to run as a GM. Another example that I don't see utilized nearly enough is there's some sort of natural disaster. Maybe this is a town set by a river, and they use that for their crops, and that is their source of fresh water, and there's an earthquake, or maybe not even anything that you can immediately sense, but for whatever reason, that river has stopped flowing. That is an immediate problem that needs to get solved. And what better way to start off a campaign than have the party save a town from clear doom? All right, step number 5 is develop a few non-player characters, or NPCs. Now, non-player characters are critical for Dungeons & Dragons generally because they are what your characters are going to be interacting with and asking questions of and getting into arguments with and all that roleplay goodness. So it's important that you have at least a few non-player characters flushed out enough and that you're comfortable enough with to actually run them and have conversations with the players with. So for session 1 in a small village, I would recommend maybe 3 or 4 key non-player characters. The reason I put this as step number 5 is because once you know the village or location that you're going to be in, and you know what the tension is, you can kind of understand or guess what non-player characters the party is going to go talk to, right? If there is a force invading from the north, for example, the party's likely going to want to talk to maybe the village elder to understand if there's some history involved. Has this happened before? They're maybe going to want to talk to whoever the military or militia or defense lead person is, or the warrior of the town, or something to that effect, right? And they're going to want to go to that person. They might not want to go talk to the random farmer who works in the south. So you don't need to worry so much about that farmer. Instead, you can focus on the non-player characters that are going to be immediately relevant. And that's an important concept in prepping as a game master. You need to focus on the areas that you think are going to be the most relevant and really spend time there, as opposed to trying to develop everything in excruciating detail. So it's a good technique to help you focus down on what you think is going to be important. Once you have 3 or 4 NPCs developed, what you're going to want to do is develop a few more just lightly and just have these in your back pocket. This is for that moment where the players come in and say, okay, we talked to that person, which you expected, but who's in that house? Instead of having to panic and coming up with John or Josephina or whoever, you have somebody developed. You have Brian the blacksmith, and you have maybe a couple small lines about him, but at least you have something. And having that kernel can really help you improvise that scene and that interaction, because you have something to start with that gets you a little bit more comfortable jumping into that scene. So again, 3 to 4 NPCs that are flushed out in a decent amount of detail, and then 3 to 4 that you're able to kind of throw into places if you need some more interaction. All right, step number 6 is develop some encounters that relate to that tension that you set up earlier in this process. So there's 2 kinds of encounters that I think about. Encounter number 1 is some kind of a landmark encounter or location. So it's going to be very much related to whatever the tension you set is. So let's say that it was a child abduction, and that what happened is that a group of goblins came down from a mine, abducted some child, and they've now taken them back into the mine. Pretty good chance that at some point the party's going to need to make their way up to that mine. So what you can do is you can set that in your mind, on your map, however you're organizing things, and have that as something that you can develop. Now, do you need to develop that entire mine system and how many goblins there are and all that right away for session 1? Probably not. Generally, I find that parties barely make it out of the village in session 1, which is totally fine. But if you want, that can be a great place to start and put some resources in, because even if they don't get there in session 1, you're going to use that. You're going to use what you've developed. It's not going to be wasted development effort. So generally, I do develop the primary first location that I go to, but it's optional. So generally what I try to do is I pick 1, 2, 3 different landmark encounters that I know where they are, so that you can have places that the players can go to, and you have that already mapped out in your head. It really helps solidify the region around that initial village. The second part is to have some slush encounters that you can kind of play with and put where you want. So the fun thing here is that it helps the world develop naturally. So it doesn't matter if, maybe you have some sort of a cool thing that they're going to run into, right? It doesn't matter if it's right outside the village, up the mountain, down the river, wherever. Once you put it there, it needs to stay there. But you can develop these cool locations or interactions and place them along whatever path the party travels down. Some people would say this is railroading. I don't think so, right? Especially if it's more of a flavor thing, it's not plot relevant, it's just a fun thing for your party to get into. I think that is totally fine, and you're welcome to place them on whatever path you want. So what I like to do is I like to have 2 of each of the 3 pillars of encounters prepped. So the 3 pillars of encounters are combat, roleplay, and exploration. So having a couple combat encounters, maybe an ambush, that sort of thing ready is good to have. Having some role-playing encounters, maybe there is a wagon that has a broken axle along a trail, and you're going to have an interesting encounter with the wagon driver, and maybe there's even some trade that can happen, or some secrets, some information that can come from that person. Or having some world building, a cool location, some mysterious magical tower that shouldn't be there. Why is that there? Something that the party can go check out. That just adds a little bit of fun and is a great way to kind of slow the party down if they're going too fast. You can put something interesting in front of them, and they can go and spend 30, 45 minutes exploring that and understanding more about the world. This brings us to step number 7, which is prep some loot. There's no worse feeling than having the party finish a combat or open a chest or discover something and say, okay, what is there? What do I find? And you have no idea what to say. Trust me, I've been in that situation a couple of times. Instead, have a few key items prepped that you can distribute to the players at the right moment. So I like to pick a few characters and have an item ready for each of them. That way, depending on what the combat was or where they found these items, you can kind of pick and choose what would make the most sense. So is it an upgraded rapier? Is it something that's going to boost somebody's initiative? Is it something that's going to help somebody stealth better? Those sorts of things are just nice to have on hand and ready to be distributed. Also, have an idea of how much gold or gems or some monetary value is reasonable to distribute to the party at this level. That way, you're just kind of ready to say, you find 40 silver pieces instead of having to worry about too much, too little. And finally, have a couple plot-relevant things you can give out. A note of battle plans that's going to be executed tomorrow that's going to help the party prep, or some religious artifact that's relevant to the main storyline that you're running. These kinds of small items can really help drive the plot forward in a very quick way, so I highly recommend prepping some of those. Alright, bonus for this video is a technique to make sure that session 1 starts running smoothly. There's nothing that feels worse than putting a ton of time and effort into prepping for session 1, only to have it get off to a rocky start. So that tip is to run a quick session 0 with your players before the campaign starts. Now, among other things, what this allows you to do is to talk to the players about their backstories a bit and understand what they're interested in doing. But also, it allows you to divulge a little bit about your world. So you'll be starting off in a village. Here's a few things about that village that you might know. Maybe you know an NPC. Maybe you know a little bit about the village's history or the geography around it. Maybe you as a GM even provide them a rough sketch of the map. That way they can be familiar with the area. By allowing your players to digest a little bit about the setting in advance, it's really going to facilitate them jumping in and having an idea of where they want to go when you start throwing curveballs. Alright, that's the end of the video. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.